We knocked on many doors today, and understandably so. Neighbors didn't want to speak on the tragedy that happened right here last week. He allegedly told a paramedic and police investigators on the scene that he killed her and then set the house on fire, according to an arrest warrant. Investigators say Dodson said his motive was an act of jealousy, resulting from establishing an open relationship with her. This was the second domestic-related murder in New London this year.
It was supposed to be just another summer night in New London, Connecticut. The streets were quiet. The house is still. But at exactly 10:03 p.m., a call came into 911 dispatch. The voice on the line was calm, almost eerily so. He said the house was on fire. He said his wife was inside. And he said it was all his fault. When firefighters arrived at 28 Sherman Street, they saw flames pouring from the windows of the home. The front door was ajar. Smoke curled into the night air. And standing outside, barefoot and uninjured, was a man, his hands stained with something darker than soot. Inside the home, they would discover a gruesome scene. A young woman just 23 years old was lying motionless, surrounded by blood. Upstairs, their 13-month-old son was still in his crib. The fire had nearly reached him, but somehow, he was still alive. The woman's name was Shelby Dodson. Her husband, George Dodson, didn't run. He didn't lie. He simply said, "I did it. I killed her." What began as a modern love story, two young parents exploring the boundaries of an open marriage, had spiraled into something nightmarish. George Dodson was a U.S. Navy technician. Quiet, disciplined. From the outside, the Dodsons looked like any young couple trying to make it work. But inside that house, resentment had been simmering. Control, jealousy, and a kind of quiet rage that no one saw coming. The turning point came when Shelby met someone else. Someone who made her smile again. George had said he was okay with sharing her. But what he really meant was only until she started to love someone more than him. And in one of the most chilling domestic cases Connecticut has seen in years, George didn't just murder his wife. He tried to take everything. Her, their son, their home. A triple destruction wrapped in one final act of rage. What made a man so desperate, so possessive, that he turned to fire and blood instead of walking away? And how did a relationship rooted in trust and consent unravel into a scene straight out of a horror film? This is the story of George Dodson. And this is how love, jealousy, and betrayal collided in the most unthinkable way. Before the blood, before the flames, there were smiles. And somewhere between those smiles, there was love. George and Shelby Dodson met like so many young couples do. At the beginning, everything felt like the perfect rhythm. Shelby was radiant, a bright-eyed young woman with a soft voice, a quick laugh, and a heart so open that people often mistook her kindness for naivety. But she wasn't naive. She was just hopeful. She believed in love, in growth, in second chances. And when she met George, she thought she'd found the man who'd believe in those things with her. George was quiet, not cold, but reserved. He'd served in the U.S. Navy. Electronics technician. Neat, efficient, methodical. They were young, barely in their 20s when they got married. A courthouse wedding. A modest ceremony. Nothing extravagant. But they didn't need extravagance. Just each other. Or so Shelby thought. In 2021, their son was born. A beautiful, giggling baby boy with Shelby's eyes and George's serious face. They named him after a family member. From the outside, they were the picture of a new family. One stroller, two smiles, three hearts connected. But in the quiet moments, things had started to shift. George, once calm, began to withdraw further into himself. His silences lasted longer. His eyes were no longer soft, they were calculating. Watching, measuring. Shelby was still trying. She posted photos, wrote captions, my little family. But behind those emojis were questions. And behind those questions was doubt. That's when the conversations began. Not arguments, just possibilities. About trust, about freedom, about whether love could evolve. George didn't say no. In fact, he said yes. Yes. They could open the marriage. Yes. They could explore. Yes. She could see someone else. And Shelby did. It wasn't fast. It wasn't scandalous. It was quiet. She met someone who made her feel heard again. Seen. And slowly, she started smiling more. But George wasn't smiling. He never said it. Not at first. But something inside him had fractured. His yes had never meant peace. It had meant control. And when he realized that Shelby had given her heart to someone else, someone new, that control was gone. Friends noticed the tension. Neighbors said they heard things. But Shelby never left. She didn't think she had to. She was trying to build a life where everyone could breathe. But George was planning something else entirely. Something final. Something that would make sure no one else would ever have what he believed belonged to him. Not her heart. Not her body. Not even her child. What no one knew then was that George Dodson had already made up his mind. And all he needed was one night. Just one. To burn it all down. July 20th, 2022. A Wednesday. In the quiet town of New London, Connecticut. It was an ordinary summer night. The air was still. The streets were calm. But inside 28 Sherman Street, a storm had begun to brew. Shelby had just put their 13-month-old son to bed. She moved through the house with the ease of someone used to juggling a baby, a job, and a man whose moods had grown heavier with each passing day. But she had no idea that George had made a decision. He had waited until the child was asleep. He had waited until the house was still. And then he acted. George Dodson took a hammer and a knife. He approached his wife. And in what prosecutors would later call a targeted, premeditated attack, he bludgeoned her, then stabbed her. Again and again. There was no struggle, no escape. Shelby was gone before she could even scream. The man who had once held her hand at the altar was now kneeling over her in a pool of her own blood. But George wasn't finished. He walked through the house, calmly pouring gasoline. In the bedroom, down the hallway, around the crib where their baby still slept. And then he struck the match. Within minutes, flames erupted across the floorboards and climbed up the walls. Smoke billowed. Fire cracked the windows. And in the center of it all, George stood motionless, watching it burn. Shelby was dead. Their child was about to be swallowed by fire. But George just walked outside. When the first fire truck arrived, they found him in the yard, covered in blood, hands blackened with soot, face blank. And when they asked him what happened, he didn't hesitate. He told them everything. He said he did it. He said he couldn't handle her being with someone else. He said, quote, "I killed my wife. I set the fire. And I tried to kill my son." His voice didn't shake. His hands didn't tremble. There were no tears, no signs of panic, just resignation. Shelby's body was found near the entryway. Her wounds were brutal, multiple blunt force injuries to the head and several stab wounds to the torso. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. Upstairs, firefighters made it to the nursery just in time. The baby was coughing, his face black with smoke, but he was alive. Barely. That child would grow up never knowing the mother who sang him to sleep, or the father who was willing to kill him just to erase the past. In the hours that followed, police secured the crime scene. Photos were taken, blood samples, burn patterns. The hammer and knife were both recovered. And George Dodson, once a Navy technician, once a husband and father, was in custody. Not fighting, not apologizing, just quiet. Just like he had always been. But this time, the silence was deafening. In the interrogation room, George Dodson didn't fidget. He didn't cry. He sat at the table with his arms crossed, like a man who had just told the truth and was ready to accept what came next. And the most unsettling part? He seemed relieved. Detectives described him as calm, almost mechanical. His tone never shifted. He answered every question. Where was the weapon? In the kitchen drawer, then in his hands. How did the fire start? He lit it with a match after pouring gasoline. Why? Because he couldn't stand the idea of her loving someone else. And what about the baby? George looked down. Then he said it. Cold. Blunt. I was going to kill him too. I didn't want him to grow up without a mother. Or with another man. He wasn't just trying to end Shelby's life. He was trying to erase the entire future she might have had without him. To George, Shelby was no longer a partner. She was a possession slipping from his grasp. And that was unforgivable. Investigators later noted how detailed he was. He remembered every step, every movement. He even explained how he timed it waiting until the baby was asleep to minimize noise. But when asked if he regretted it, he paused. Not because he was overcome with guilt, but because he was trying to decide whether regret would even matter. It's done, he said. There's no taking it back. One detective later said that George reminded him of someone flipping a switch. From husband to killer. From man to monster. No rage, no chaos, just execution. And all of it planned. There was no moment of passion. No sudden snap. George had decided long before that night that if he couldn't have her, no one could. The confession was airtight. The evidence? Overwhelming. Blood spatter matched his clothing. The gasoline traces were unmistakable. The hammer still had Shelby's hair embedded in it. George Dodson wasn't going to trial to prove his innocence. He was going to trial because the law required it. And even then, he offered no fight. No appeals, no justifications, just silence. The same silence Shelby had grown used to in their final months. The same silence that echoed through the house after she was gone. And now, that silence was permanent. The fire was extinguished, the body removed, the killer in custody. Yet, the house at 28 Sherman Street bore the scars of that night. Amidst the charred remains, a 13-month-old boy had survived. His name remains undisclosed, shielded from the public eye. He was rescued by firefighters, pulled from his crib with moments to spare. His tiny lungs filled with smoke, his pajamas soaked with soot. But he was alive. The Department of Children and Families took immediate custody. He was placed with relatives. An aunt, a grandmother, someone who could provide a new beginning. But no one could replace his mother, and no one could explain what his father had done. George Dodson was arraigned in court days later, shackled, silent. His face was unchanged, and the judge denied bail. The charges? Murder, attempted murder of a minor, arson, risk of injury to a child. In February 2025, Dodson pleaded guilty to murder, first-degree arson, and risk of injury to a minor. On April 30th, 2025, Judge John M. Newsom sentenced him to 50 years in prison. But none of that mattered to the child. Because what's justice to a toddler who'll never know what he's lost? What's closure? When you've only just learned to walk? Shelby's funeral was small, quiet. Family, friends, neighbors. And though the baby was there, he didn't know what the flowers meant. He didn't understand why people kept touching his hair. He just looked around, searching, for a face he would never see again. And somewhere in the back row, a photo of Shelby sat beside the casket. Bright eyes, open smile, the kind of face that made you believe things would be okay. But they weren't, and they never would be. Because what George Dodson left behind wasn't just a murder scene. It was a child without a mother, a family forever haunted, and a town that would never again look at love the same way. In a quiet courtroom in New London, Connecticut, the man who ended it all was finally sentenced. George Dodson stood before the judge, wearing a standard correctional jumpsuit. The same man who once wore a Navy uniform. The same man who had once promised Shelby forever. Now, he was facing a number. 50 years. That's how long the state of Connecticut decided he should remain behind bars. Not for a moment, not for a breakdown, but for a decision. One he had made long before he picked up the hammer, long before he poured the gasoline. The judge called it an act of calculated cruelty. Prosecutors called it a premeditated erasure. The defense said nothing, because what do you say when the horror speaks for itself? George Dodson was given the opportunity to speak. He apologized, but there was no passion in his voice, no trembling, no emotion. Just a man repeating what the court expected him to say. I'm sorry, I wish I hadn't done it. But no words would undo the truth. Shelby was gone. Her son would grow up with the weight of a legacy he never asked for. And George? He would grow old behind concrete and steel. He will be 92 years old when his sentence expires. If he lives that long. There was no dramatic outburst, no final twist, just a gavel, a number, and a man led away in chains. Outside the courtroom, Shelby's family held hands. Some cried. Some stared blankly at the floor. There's no real peace in these stories. Justice may be served, but the law stays. The silence lingers. The birthdays missed. The motherless mornings. The echoes of what could have been. One family member later said, "There's no winning, but maybe now we can breathe again." George Dodson is now an inmate in the prison.
We knocked on many doors today, and understandably so. Neighbors didn't want to speak on the tragedy that happened right here last week. Flowers sit at the stoop of this home on Sherman Street in New London, a stark reminder of what happened here last Wednesday. Door knock after door knock, neighbors are still too shaken up to talk about Shelby Dodson, who was allegedly killed by her husband, George Dodson.
It was definitely violent, which we've seen across the state over the last 2 years.
Dodson is accused of stabbing and beating Shelby to death with a knife and a hammer, then setting the house on fire with their 1-year-old child inside. He allegedly told a paramedic and police investigators on the scene that he killed her and then set the house on fire, according to an arrest warrant. Investigators say Dodson said his motive was an act of jealousy, resulting from establishing an open relationship with her. This was the second domestic-related murder in New London this year. A murder-suicide in January. The suspect shot his girlfriend, set their house on fire, and shot himself.
The violence in terms of the homicides that we've seen has increased. So that's something that is consistent in this case.
How violent crimes and crimes involving children have also increased in Connecticut.
We have seen that children under 6, that's been a trend as well.
Their child is still alive and in stable condition, a living piece to Shelby her family will fortunately have. And as the flowers on her front porch bloom in her honor, she'll be remembered. In New London, DeAndrea Turner, Fox 61 News.
He resides in a Connecticut state prison. He gets 3 meals a day and a cell. But the boy, Shelby's son, gets a lifetime of questions, of silence, of growing up in a world where his father's name is tied forever to the day his mother died. Stories like this always seem to begin with love, a smile, a wedding, a promise. And somewhere along the way, that love changes shape. It narrows, it controls, and then it kills. George Dodson was not a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a husband, a father, a U.S. Navy sailor. And to the outside world, everything looked normal. But domestic violence rarely looks like a horror story from the outside. It often begins in whispers, with isolation, jealousy. It escalates slowly. A slammed door, a bruised ego, a growing sense of control, until one day, it ends in a headline. And by then, it's too late. Shelby didn't get the future she deserved. Her son will grow up with a legacy carved in ash and silence. And George Dodson will live the rest of his life in a prison of his own making. But this case, it doesn't end with the gavel. Because somewhere, another woman is watching this right now. Maybe she's in a similar situation. Maybe she hasn't told anyone. Maybe she's afraid of what might happen if she does. If that's you, please, say something before it's too late, before someone lights a match. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story resonated with you, or if you believe someone else needs to hear it, please don't forget to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel for more real crime stories that matter. We tell these stories because they need to be told, and we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Was justice truly served? Let us know in the comment section below. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and take care of each other.